Welcome and thank you for joining us for another free webinar from ASTQB, the U.S. Board for ISTQB Software Testing. We're excited to welcome back Philip Liu, the CEO of Exposoft, who has presented on the topic of Agile previously, and today we'll be going a little more into Agile testing with the topic Agile and Waterfall. What do testers do differently? How do testing practices differ when you're on an Agile versus a Waterfall team? Do you still have step-by-step test scripts or just have general test scenarios or user stories? Do you still need a test plan? We will learn the answers in this webinar as Philip Liu shares his experiences in working with both Agile-based and Waterfall-based clients, and I'll offer tips on their transition successes. At this point, I'd like to turn it over to Phil Liu. And Phil, thanks for, again, presenting another webinar with ASTQB.
Thanks, Dave. Yeah, last time we had the webinar on the 7 highly effective habits of Agile, and there were just so many questions related to what people actually do in an Agile testing team, so we thought we'd have this webinar to really focus on that, so I'm really glad to be back. So, I think that the main thing about Waterfall versus Agile is being ready for testing. In Waterfall, we had this environment where we were waiting for software to be delivered to us to be tested, and then we were ready to test. But in Agile, we're ready to test all the time. And so, we're doing testing activities all the time. And so, what are these testing activities, and how do these testing activities correspond to the Agile cycle? So that's what we're going to be talking about today. And I think that the most important, I guess you could say, cliche to think about in terms of Agile is that it's not a rocket science. It's really not a big technology shift, but really a change in focus and timing. And I like to think about it in terms of having the right people in the right place, doing the right thing at the right time. So we have to think about what is right. And I know that a lot of circles, they talk about Agile being where quality is everyone's responsibility, and you have everybody doing everything. But that's not really the case. But first of all, here's just a really short introduction about myself. You can find me on LinkedIn and all kinds of stuff about me, but I think probably more interesting, at least to me, is that I really love being in the outdoors, and cycling is one of my passions. And I'm old now, but I used to be young and used to do a little bit of racing and had some fun doing it as well. But today's all about you, and here's some questions that we had coming out of the last webinar. Do we need a test plan? How are our testing practices differently? Do we have test scripts, or we just do some general test scenarios? With Waterfall testing, we usually have some pretty detailed test cases that we run through. But how does this differ with Agile? So I hope that's why you're here, because these are the kind of questions that we're going to answer today. I always like to set expectations, and so whenever there's green, that means ask lots of questions, and you can feel free to ask questions inside the GoToWebinar panel. I won't read slides, so they're for you as a takeaway. And of course, like Dave said, you can watch the recording. During the session today, I may focus on some points on a slide and then skip over others, and so we hope that you can just listen along and follow as we go. This slide here I made very slow on purpose because, when I think about Agile, I think to myself, well, who doesn't want to be Agile? And the creators of Agile certainly thought of a great name for it because, if you're not Agile, what are you? Oh, I want to be slow and clumsy. I don't want to be Agile. So, I think Agile has a lot of popularity just by its name. Who doesn't want to be Agile, right? So I was thinking about that, and I started doing some research, into Agile, here's a, everybody loves Raymond, everybody loves Agile because who doesn't want to be Agile? And if you look at the Agile testing term, it looks like, wow, it's really had a lot of growth over the last 10, 12 years, probably in terms of people searching and finding and looking for information on it, 2 to 3 times in terms of growth of people searching for information on Agile testing. And then if I compare that to software testing in general, software testing in general has gone down by about the same amount in terms of people searching for information on it, by 1/3 probably of what it was before. But the thing is that when you compare the two, and this is the danger and possibly benefits of looking at big data together, is that you see that software testing still dwarfs Agile testing. So be careful when you're looking at data and how popular Agile testing is. Software testing, although much less searched for, is still a big deal and probably will still be a major search term after Agile testing is long gone. I also did some thinking about, what the relative searches by geography, and it turns out that people in India are very interested in Agile testing and software testing versus other countries, and I thought that was very interesting as well. So why are we here? Well, Agile is really applying life, I would say life problem-solving techniques to the software community and software projects. So, when you think about it, when I was making dinner last night, okay, I made some spaghetti sauce, and if it was a little bit too salty, then I have a retrospective, and I decide, okay, next time I'm going to add more or add less salt, right? So the thing is that with Agile, we cut these iterations down just like we would when we're cooking a meal, and we do an analysis of what it turned out like and change the recipe for the next time. And so a lot of things have happened in the last 10 years. Startup costs for building software, you no longer need a 50 to 100-man company with $10 million in funding to start up a software company. And that's because of many technology changes, mobile and cloud, and software development techniques that enable, a handful of people to put together a product very, very quickly. And so you don't need $10 million in funding to start up a software company anymore. And you also, in terms of reaching customers, you can reach them a lot more easily via different delivery models, app stores and so on. Software is just sold online by the month, so there are more than enough users that are willing to try your software out. And in a way, that actually drives the need for higher quality because users can just quit and go someplace else. And that changes ways that we work. And so we're now working in smaller teams, delivering faster, trying to listen to the user, collecting data on them, figuring out what they're doing. And this whole movement has really brought about Agile. And so when we think about Agile, you've heard it said that testing is done by everyone. Well, I like to say that testing is done by qualified team members and that developers could do some testing tasks. And on the flip side, development is not done by everyone. Development is done by qualified team members. And sometimes testers, if they can, or if they have the ability, could take on development tasks. So, when I think about that, everybody still has a specialty. And, when I think about, for instance, Tom Brady, he probably could play linebacker. Maybe he could, but he's still probably best at quarterback. And so when you think about our own teams that we put together in Agile, we still have our own specialties that we're good at and that we should probably continue doing that and building our skills in those areas to contribute the best to the team. Now this is a typical flavor of Agile, which is Scrum. What we're going to do today is divide up the what testers do in terms of three parts here. So I divided into 3 parts, and the first part will be on the planning side. The second part will be on actually within the sprint itself when developers are developing stuff. And then the last part will be in the retrospective. So I've organized the presentation according to these 3 sections, and we'll just kind of, I'll put these in the upper left for each slide so we kind of know where we are. So this is Agile planning. So what do testers do in Agile planning? Well, I like to, in some of the clients that I've worked with, we have recommended that testers, that we plan to pair testers with other people. Kind of like a version of extreme programming, except with testers, and programming them or pairing them with different experts in different areas, not only in testing specialties, but also in the domain area for them to learn and work with business analysts so that you can get benefits in both directions, actually, because the business analysts can then begin to work on developing more complete and correct stories. When pairing with different types of testing experts, we can then enhance our skills and move towards other areas and possibly, develop our ability to play linebacker if we want to in different positions on the team. As a critical part of the plan, testing is not an afterthought, and I like to think of that. It's one of the things that I really push when I'm with our clients, is that a lot of times the developers will do the poker planning, and depending on the difficulty of the story and how it is to implement, they might give it a 5 or a 9 or something like that. But then the testing is left out of that until the end. And so I like to have testers actually play the planning poker as well for particular stories, so that our input is part of the actual whole plan. And this actually fits in with workload management. One of the main principles of Agile is sustainable, right? So unfortunately, if we're always working overtime, then that is not very sustainable, and you end up having a lot of turnover or sick time, and that disturbs the continuity of the team and affects all kinds of things, mostly not only the velocity but also the quality of the software. So it's important to maintain sustainability, which means really thinking about estimating and considering those testing estimates as part of the original plan. So, the most important thing is to really think about prioritizing what we're doing here. So I know that in the heat of the sprint, we end up with all these things to do, but at least if we have all these things to do kind of written down and prioritized, we can go down the list, and at least we'll be working on the right things at the right time. So that's kind of a back-of-the-envelope approach to risk-based testing, but it applies to everything that we do, really, because there's just not going to be enough time to do everything that we want to. We don't like to work on weekends, right? Who likes to work on weekends? Raise your hand. I see about 10 hands out there. Okay, so the other thing we want to plan for in the Agile planning is technical debt. And so Agile, we want to try to reduce our backlog of bugs and keep that low, and keep our time to fix within the sprint. So planning for actually fixing defects as part of planning to reduce and keep technical debt to a minimum is actually part of the plan. And you may even have what's called a stabilization sprint or a fixing sprint, where you every 10 sprints you do a specific sprint that's targeted towards managing technical and reducing defects. The thing about Agile is that a lot of times the test basis will change. So with each iteration, it's important to think about how these changes, what the changes are, and how these changes are going to affect you. So, for instance, you may discover that the product is being used differently than what you thought. And so you can, of course, discover this from different analytics and so forth. And so based on the usage patterns of your users, you may plan and prioritize certain areas of the software more than others. Or you may change your acceptance tests. You may change the environment based on the environments that your customers are working in. And of course, the stories change with each sprint as well, or each iteration. So it's important to really think about changing and adapting the test basis with each iteration. Let's see. Well, I can't really talk about this enough in terms of breaking down tasks, and when the sprint planning is done, to include all of the tasks in there with the same Fibonacci rating of numbers and time taken to do stuff, not just with the development tasks. User stories need to be really clear, and so I think that like I said, pairing testers with business analysts that are working on user stories, it ends up that you have a much higher probability of having a complete and clear user story. And so that's one thing that testers can really contribute to. And they say that most of the defects are based on requirements or errors in requirements. So if we can get up front there and work on the user stories rather than just getting the user story or having it delivered to us, and then having to take the user story and convert it into test cases or testing scenarios, getting in front of it is a really key aspect of preventing defects. And that goes with grooming, right? So we want to groom our stories with clear language and actually work with product owners and end users if we can, and think about, when we look at these user stories, we want to predict and think about alternate interpretations of a user story. How could that user story be made more clear? What are ways that it could be confusing to anyone? What are ways that it could be confusing to a guy off the street, right? Or a new developer that happens to be working on that story? What are ways that negative, we call it negative testing, but in terms of taking that thought and moving it upstream, what are alternate or erroneous flows, right? And thinking about also, and this is the way that adults learn, is they learn based on what they already know. So if we can also take stories and relate it to concepts and functions that are already understood to people, then that will really help in terms of making a new story more clear and avoiding ambiguity. A lot of things that go into planning that sometimes we overlook. Developing and maintaining an infrastructure. I can't say enough about how some of this stuff ends up taking a lot of time, and we overlook it, right? So, thinking about tools, the frameworks, data, and the environments, and making sure that they're up to date and that they're automated where possible to refresh data or refresh environments, updating versions, and so on. That tends to take more time than we give it credit to, and that's important to put into your plan. In terms of test data, that's kind of like the the basis of doing any testing. You need real data, right? So it's important to think about what I call chores, data chores, um, in how to automate as much as possible, generating, capturing, and organizing the data, and making sure that it's good data. So you need to have procedures that validate the data, and then procedures to change and refresh the data. All this stuff takes time and is very often overlooked. So they need to be planned in as part of the sprint. Um, and functional testing, that's the normal testing that we all think about, but I think this is one of the ways that you prioritize and answer the question being, how do we keep up? Well, we need to prioritize according to that particular iteration or sprint. Sometimes you may prioritize in terms of the way stories interact. You may prioritize in terms of cross functions, or prioritize exploratory testing in a particular functional area or group of stories that are related. And of course, don't forget non-functional testing. We often forget about this to the end, but you'd be surprised how many usability errors or glitches you can find within a couple of hours, and or how many security holes that you can find just running a couple of simple open source tools. So it's important to plan these things into your sprint as well, not just waiting until the end when you deliver to the client or at the end of the sprint where you think, oh shoot, we didn't do the performance testing or we didn't do any security testing. Plan this stuff in. Review your tests. These kinds of things need to be planned in as well. So taking a look at your tests and looking at the results of the tests helps you to gain insight as to what kinds of tests are more important than others. So not only looking at the test basis, but looking at your tests themselves and how you can improve those. Those are also need to be planned in into the work plan. And lastly, plan for change. I think that it's pretty straightforward in Agile that we do need to do test automation. We need to automate as much as possible because sprints, as you know, are very short. And in order to keep up and, like I said, focus on the right things, we need to automate some things that need to be done, but maybe we don't necessarily want to focus on those in terms of our manual attention. And so a lot of times, we go into an organization and we work with them and their testers in developing new skills and introducing tools that they can use to help them to automate. And so it's really best if testers are equipped with, I guess you could say, an automation toolbox. The automation toolbox would consist of tools that you could use for static testing, as well as automated unit testing, as well as automated functional testing. Now let's talk about what happens actually during the sprint, the things that you're going to be doing that may be a little bit different. So this is area number 2. And so again, tester pairing. I think it's important to actually even pair with programmers. And in pairing with programmers and with other testers, with programmers for one, you can work with them on white box testing and the acceptance test driven development, where you're actually helping to develop tests for their code and understanding the programming logic that goes behind the test that you're writing later on, and vice versa. They also get a lot of benefit from you in terms of thinking about how a tester thinks from an end user point of view in executing the code and all of the different negative paths that come to your mind that they don't think about naturally. So this helps both directions. And I've seen actual people in different teams where what I call extreme testing, where you have two testers sitting together, working on a function together, and so they may be looking over each other's shoulders, but they're also kind of doing their own thing, and each of them is sharing the work as they're going, and it really is, you think that, oh, it's just double the testers, but the same amount of coverage, but you really get really deep, not only in the testing itself, but sharing in the learning of that particular module or in different options in the program. It's proven really helpful in some of the sites that I've been to. Okay, so I mentioned this already in terms of what you do. We have test-driven development, automated testing. I'm also going to talk about exploratory testing and continuous integration. So as far as test-driven development goes, I think that it's pretty clear, when you do the pairing with a programmer, you work on defining the test, right? So you work together on the user story, you're looking at the user story, understanding the user story together, and working on developing tests and unit tests with the developer so that they can develop code to pass that test. And of course, all that's driven by the user story, and of course, hopefully we as testers are involved in developing the user story so that we don't, it's not just handed to us where we have to figure things out. And let me go back here. Actually, you can apply this to, behavior-driven development, acceptance test development, and so forth. Unit testing. You can run unit tests every hour or once a day or once a week. But I believe that unit tests should be, we should be working on unit tests and static code analysis during a sprint. There's many tools that you can use, both open source and commercial. And although you may not find defects, you can find problems that precede defects. So this is an important part of what we should be doing as testers during the sprint. And of course, there's the normal, what we call functional testing, automation testing that we normally think about. And this, combined with the automated unit testing and static analysis, really works together with all those other methods and tools to help us to increase our velocity. You notice that term there, I say testing velocity, right? It's not just the velocity, but our testing velocity and minimizing our regression risk. Selenium and Finesse is some of the open source tools that are available for that. There's many other open source as well as different types of frameworks for Selenium, as well as Cucumber for behavior automated testing as well. Okay. Static analysis. So we should be working on doing static analysis, running some of these tools that look at the complexity, dead code, or whether we have a lot of duplicate code out there. Duplicate code and dead code and complex code, of course, those three things lead to difficulty in maintaining the code, which is also part of technical debt, which we're trying to reduce, right? So a lot of things that we can identify doing these kinds of analysis, they're not necessarily related to directly finding defects, but they go into preventing defects. So that's one of the things that we should be focusing on in terms of shifting our thinking and our focus away from finding defects to also preventing defects. Next is exploratory testing. If you've implemented a lot of these automated techniques in automated unit tests, in running static analysis tests, then you have more time to do what I think is actually more fun, which is exploratory testing. And exploratory testing, it's not the same thing as ad hoc testing. So what we do in exploratory testing is we really, I think of it as a structured experiment. And so in a structured experiment, you say, okay, we're going to have this experiment for an hour, 2 hours, whatever you decide the time box of that. And you actually have a purpose and a focus, and I call that a charter or a mission for that exploratory testing session or time box. And so in exploratory testing, you're designing the experiment, right? So we're going to work on this particular function for this amount of time, and we're going to assign these resources to it. And then of course, you execute that, you do the testing for that particular time box, and then you take a look. Again, you have a retrospective on what you were able to learn during that time box. So some examples of charters that you may have in an exploratory testing session. You may want to focus on failures and errors in recovery, right? So maybe there is certain areas of the software that you're testing that are particularly prone to errors, and you want to focus on those. Maybe you want to focus on a particular function area, a functional area, or a menu drop-down list, and all the things that are covered underneath that menu, and all the submenus. Or maybe you want to have an exploratory testing session on the emerging behaviors. So taking a look at analytics of your users, and then pretending that you're a user and thinking about their emerging behaviors and doing the things that they're starting to do, which oftentimes are not the same thing that we expect them to do or expected them to do. So this is kind of getting outside of what we normally think of what the software is supposed to do, and really looking at the users and testing it in ways that they use the software. Other areas that you could focus on for exploratory testing could be attacking the software in terms of doing some security attacks. There are many good books on how to hack and attack software in terms of security. Or you may have a performance testing exploratory charter where you, and this doesn't have to be some special tools. You could actually do things heuristically and just rate things as slow, medium, and fast, or slow, medium, and acceptable. And so what you'll find is, if you, for instance, we've had testers go through, say, the top 30 scenarios based on emerging behaviors, right? So you may list out the 30 scenarios and say, okay, we're going to execute these 30 and see and rate them in terms of performance, and you'll find that, without any special tools, just doing exploratory testing, you can find, say, for instance, the 5 slowest scenarios just on a relative basis, and then you can use that as input into more formal performance testing. Like I said before, depending on the scope of the exploratory testing session, so for like what I said there about the heuristic-based performance testing, maybe you might want to dedicate a half a day or even 1 day to that kind of thing. For a short session, in terms of perhaps looking at a particular function, maybe you want to have 2 hours to half a day on that one. And of course, just like with the rest of Agile, you want to have review your findings, right? You want to see what worked and what didn't. And you may want to think about, okay, did we learn what we should have learned or what we could have learned in this session, or should we do another session? You can use that as a seed to do another session to go deeper in that same particular area, Or during that session, you may have discovered other areas that you need to focus on and perhaps do an exploratory session on something else that is an offshoot of what you discovered in the previous session. And of course, don't forget to document all the decisions that you made, what you did, what you discovered along the way. Okay, continuous integration. I don't need to say too much about this, but your continuous integration should be integrated and work together with your automated unit testing and your automated functional testing. And that should serve as the foundation of what I call smoke regression. Excuse me. So what the continuous integration and combined with these other things will do is enable you to really detect integration problems and defects before they work their way into the code. Lastly, the retrospective. Let's talk about that. In the retrospective, we as testers, we should be thinking about where do we waste time, right? So maybe, you get together and you say, well, we did this, but, I don't think it was very useful because of certain, maybe you didn't find anything, or maybe some things were not testable. Not testable, not meaning that it wasn't ready for testing, but there are many things that could cause certain functions not to be testable. And of course, what tasks fell off your plate and why? When you went down your priority list because you prioritize things in your plan, right? When you went down your priority list and the bottom 1/3 or even the bottom half of things didn't get done, then you need to think about why they didn't get done. And so there are a lot of reasons for that. Of course, everybody says not enough resources, but maybe they shouldn't have even been on the list to begin with. And a lot of times, and if you think about just human nature, when we have a really long to-do list and we only get done half of it, it doesn't feel very good, right? And so maybe think about some of those things in terms of your testing scope for an iteration. And maybe you just take those things off and think about putting them onto the next, prioritizing those in the next iteration. Maybe, for instance, that was security testing, a non-functional area. And so, and that brings me kind of to one other thing was that, and I'm not sure, I think I should have mentioned it earlier, a lot of times we take these, what we recommend and work with clients on in an Agile team is taking specialized areas such as performance, such as security and automation, and having testers that work outside of the sprint and outside of the normal Agile team and iterations and so forth, and considering them working on long-term projects where they develop automation code, they're developing performance tests, and security tests, security routines. They're, of course, using the input from the retrospectives and from the sprint in terms of what they automate, what kinds of things go into the performance scripts, just like from the exploratory testing sessions that I just talked about a minute ago. And they work outside of the normal sprint team, and they're considered a long-term project. And this enables you to get done those things that are important, but quote unquote not urgent, right? And some of those times, a lot of times, those are the kinds of things that don't get done, and they fall off your plate, but they're really, really important to get done. And so it's important to think about those things and separate them off and work on them separately because, one of the questions, actually, here's a question that just came in. It says, how do we keep up, right? How do we keep up in a 2-week sprint? Well, that's kind of how you keep up in terms of being able to separate out special projects that need to be worked on a long term. You can't expect to develop too much automation code actually during the sprint. You can and be able to keep up with it all. And that leads to the last question there. Is automation doing what we want, right? So like I said, there's different types of automation. So you have automated unit tests, right? And like I said earlier, unit tests will not necessarily find defects, but will ensure the quality of your code and ensure that possibly that your code is not too complex and prevent defects down the road. But maybe depending on the experience of your programmers, maybe you say, okay, well, we can kind of get a little bit more relaxed more on that and focus on some other aspect of automation. So it's important to look at the automation, look at what you're getting out of that particular kind of automation, and think about, well, okay, let's focus on another area of automation where I think we can get more bang for the buck based on our particular team and our experience and things like that. Okay, and of course, we want to take a look at the defects, right? So looking at the defects that were introduced is important. Sometimes in some Agile teams, Scrum teams, I've noticed that they don't even log defects during a sprint, and I think that this can be a mistake because it's important to be able to know where defects come from. So any defect that you could set a threshold for defects that are older than a certain number of hours, or defects that come out during a continuous integration run, which you probably do once a day or something like that, or once every half a day. But it's important to really understand the sources of the defects and where defects are introduced. And thinking about those things will help you to get to common causes and then how to avoid those things. And you may find that by analyzing the defects, that certain areas of your code or certain functions or functionality in your software is where things get kind of dicey, and that will also have input into your testing strategy, into your testing focus. Maybe you use that and figure out, okay, well, we need to increase the automation in this area, or we need to have some exploratory testing sessions in these areas in order to reduce our defects coming out the door. So it's important to really look at this and have this impact your testing strategy and your testing planning in the beginning for the next sprint. And lastly, collaboration, right? So collaboration is supposed to be one of the key principles of Agile. And so, of course, the top one is, did we deliver what was expected? And if the answer is no, then there are many reasons for that. Maybe we didn't understand what we were supposed to deliver. If we didn't understand what we were supposed to deliver, we delivered the wrong thing. That's okay, because it really is a 2-week sprint, right? And we can shift and change. But it's important to think about why is it that we did not deliver what was expected, and then you can get back to the plan, right? You get back to the plan and the pairing up with business analysts and story grooming, looking at those kinds of activities, going backwards from did we deliver what was expected. If the answer is no, then you need to look at those stories and see if there are ways that you could have learned how to make them more clear, if there are ways that you could have learned how to think about alternate paths, things like that. Did we collaborate well with our developers? Did we learn from them, and not only that, did they learn from us? Um, and of course, if you're in a large company, you have other teams working together to integrate their software or their pieces into the pie at the very end. And so if there are a lot of problems at the end, then you need to think about, how was our collaboration with the other sprint teams that didn't work quite as well as it should have, which ended up resulting in a lot of these integration issues at the end. And so think about how we could increase or improve the collaboration so that we don't have these last minute integration problems at the end. And in doing so, in thinking about the collaboration for all of these instances, you always want to think about, what information was missed or not communicated and why, right? And so there are a lot of reasons for that. So some of the reasons could be that um, some guy disappeared and was sick or something like that, or it could be that one of the people on the team is not as communicative as you want them to be. It could be that the product owner was missing during some key meetings. And so, think about the reasons for those things and try to, so, if that's the case where the product owner was missing during certain meetings, then we need to think about, informing the product owner and say, hey, because of you weren't here and we had a few mishaps and missteps and it's really important. We really need you. So again, getting back to the source in terms of what information was missed, why was it not communicated, and that will help you to improve your collaboration and your software and quality in general. So now we're on to part 4, the end. Let me talk about what we've talked about today and hopefully summarize some of the key points. So successfully going Agile, like I said before, Agile is not a technique, it's not a technology, although you do use certain technologies, different types of automation within Agile. That's not Agile itself. And Agile can be done without a book, right? So be agile about being agile. It doesn't have to be a 2-week iteration. If you look at the Agile principles, it just says shorter is better than longer, right? So you don't need to buy the Scrum book off the shelf and do it that way, just as you don't need to join Weight Watchers to lose weight, right? You can develop your own plan that works for you in your organization, given the experience of your team members and the goals that you have. And think about it, it's a long-term project. It's not a short-term thing. It's really tough to change your diet and your lifestyle. It's tough to change your habits if you're coming from a waterfall environment. Sometimes you have setbacks, and that's why it's important to use those retrospectives when you have a setback and think about how you can improve and continue to work on changing your I call it, instead of lifestyle, it's a work style. Some summary, brief summary here. So significant shift in timing of what we do as testers when we do it. I think that we need to embrace these changes as testers, learn new skills, take on a different mindset in collaboration, in that everyone is responsible for quality, and that means that we're not just pounding away and going through test cases anymore, but we're actually having input into the user stories and actually input into what gets tested and input into what gets developed. And so, Agile doesn't mean no test plan, right? So think about the items that we listed out in area number 1 throughout this morning or throughout this afternoon. Now think about those things, and for each iteration that you have, when you think about your test plan, um, let's say there were 10 areas there that I listed out to think about as input into your test plan. Maybe you'd pick out the top 3 for that particular iteration as key priorities, and then list 3 more as intermediate priorities. And those things may change with each iteration. They may change in terms of testing area, maybe it's performance one time, or they may change in terms of functionality, or it may change in terms of cross-functional or cross-story testing in terms of your focus for your plan for that iteration. And then be flexible in the heat of the sprint, right? You want to follow the plan and get done what you plan on getting done, at least those high priority things. But also, I like to use the term that go where you are wanted and needed. So a lot of times in the heat of a sprint, things come up, right? So perhaps one developer is running a little bit behind on being able to accomplish his particular or her particular task or her function that they're trying to get done. And so you may jump in and work with them on automated unit tests. So be flexible on what you're doing there. And it also may come up that you need to have exploratory sessions on certain areas, functional areas, because you need to think about negative types of paths that users may take and be able to enumerate those in order to clarify a story. And lastly, I can't emphasize this enough, and that is the retrospective, right? So we can have a testing retrospective also, and I like to think of that in terms of looking back at like I said, where we wasted time, what was worthy and what was not worthy of our time and focus for that particular iteration. And we didn't have that testing retrospective opportunity in Waterfall that we do in Agile, and that's really gives us a lot of power in terms of looking at where we can improve. And I think that's all I've got, Dave. Is there any questions here? Thanks very much, everyone, for attending the webinar. If you're a real knowledge type of a seeker, you can go to our website and get a couple of different resources there. But maybe, Dave, is there some questions that came in?
There are, and if you have additional questions, feel free to go ahead and use your GoToWebinar control panel to submit those. I have a question that there's a question, but then there's some description that goes with it. So bear with me for just a moment.
Yeah.
It says, where does test design fit? We have inexperienced testers on our Agile team. The speed of testing in Agile and the fact that our team is physically dispersed makes it difficult to improve the effectiveness of these testers. So again, where does test design fit when you have that kind of environment?
Well, test design actually fits in. It's a key activity during the sprint, right? So test design has to be planned for one, right? And like I said earlier in the presentation, we're not usually, because we are in an Agile environment co-located, we're not developing test cases that are really, really granular is the right word. But we're developing test scripts that are a little bit more general and give flexibility to the tester to implement that particular test script depending on the focus of the sprint. But I'm not sure if I answered your question. Now, you were talking about testers that are not in the same location. Is that right, Dave?
That's correct. So they're not necessarily in the same location.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I think to testers that are not in the same location, we've had this issue before, is that for those kinds of testers, it's important for them to really get deeply trained and understand the domain and the software functionality in order to understand higher level test design so that you can take those test scripts, which are general and broader in Agile than they are in Waterfall, and use that as input for developing your own kind of test cases in your mind and implementing them according to what's needed. You know, it's really tough for a remote tester to work on an Agile team unless they really understand the software. So I think developing a deep understanding of the software and then using that understanding to work with broadly designed test scripts is the way to go.
I think that's helpful. I think that's helpful. A couple of other questions for you. So, if the test scope is changing,
Mm-hmm.
how do you decide what to do? I mean, you know, there's probably more options than there are time. So, if the test scope is changing, how do you decide what to do?
Well, you know, I think that each, you know, when you have your daily stand-up meeting, a lot of times certain areas will require more focus and priority than others. Um, so, you know, you would definitely dive in and help, like I said, go where you're wanted and needed. Um, but as far as the test basis changing, right, I mentioned that earlier in the presentation, that a lot of times your test basis will change and shift, and those kinds of things are done in your planning. So when you do your plan and you look at the test basis and think about how that's shifted from the previous iteration and the different focus, and use that as input into your particular, I guess you could say, test plan for that iteration. So
Okay,
you do
good.
acknowledge that the test scope is changing just by analyzing the basis.
Okay. Another question: when it comes to usability testing, I
Mm-hmm.
mean, isn't that too expensive? Isn't that expensive and too time-consuming to do in Agile?
Yeah, you know, a lot of people think that usability testing is difficult, but it really isn't. There are a lot of setups that you could use for, you can set up for under $200 with where you have, say, 5 users step through some your top scenarios or your top new scenarios, right, being developed. And what you'll find is that just by having 5 users, you can discover 80% of the problems in usability. And so you may wonder, well, how is that? Kind of like how I know that is that I guess you could say the godfather of usability, Jacob Nielsen, did a study where, depending on how you select your users, of course you can't select users off the street. You have to select people that are, accustomed to using your software. But you can discover, 80% of the problems with 5 users, and you can do that in half an hour.
Hmm. No, that's great. That's helpful.
Yeah.
So we have time for one more question, and it's a great question. So what do we do if there is nothing to test?
Oh, okay. So you're that's still thinking about the waterfall mode of thinking in terms of waiting for software to be delivered. But if you think about it, there's many things that we can do as testers instead of waiting, right? We can be reviewing and improving user stories. We can be paired up with developers, right, and helping them to develop unit tests for their code. We can be learning how to do static analysis and understand code complexity. There's just all kinds of things that we can do. So, in terms of waiting for fully developed features or functions that we're just going to be testing as an end user, sure, that's not available for us to do a lot of times, but there are a lot of other activities that I listed out in area number 2, which, in the heat of the sprint, that we could be doing that are very, very useful in improving the quality of the software. So improving the quality of the software, we think of as a general mission of testers, and that includes more than just doing the the typical black box testing that we're used to doing.
No, that's a great answer, and the whole webinar has really had incredible information. I think this gives everyone a great head start if they don't already have their ISTQB Agile Tester Extension certification. If you don't know what that is, or if you don't have it yet, I would encourage you to learn more about that at astqb.org. As Phil had mentioned, we're also recording this webinar, so if you have any colleagues who wanted to learn more about this topic, in a few days we'll have that posted in the library at astqb.org. And there are all kinds of resources. If you've not been there recently, there are a number of free white papers and other webinar recordings. So a lot of great stuff there as well. So I want to again thank Phil Liu for his webinar. This has been incredible, and we hope we can talk you into joining us again some other time for another webinar in the future.
Okay, thanks a lot, Dave.
All right, and with that, we will conclude this this webinar, and we thank everyone for joining us.